Welcome to Smart Talk, where we speak with leading academics and other thoughtful persons on the important challenges facing the world today. My name is Edward Dodson. I'm a longtime member of the faculty of the Henry George School of Social Science. For this episode, I have the pleasure of speaking with New School Professor of International Cooperation and Development, Willi Semmler, co-author with Unurjargal Nyambuu, I hope I have his name pronounced correctly, of the book Sustainable Macroeconomics, Climate Risks, and Energy Transitions. Professor Semmler was born in Germany and completed his formal education there, earning his PhD in 1976 at the Free University of Berlin. He joined the faculty of the New School in 1980 and chaired the Department of Economics from 2005 to 2008. Professor Semmler and his co-author have a very sobering message for us regarding the connection between existing public policies and our ability to respond to climate change. They make the case for the use of, quote, macroeconomic and dynamic tools that have stood the test of time. A real question, of course, is whether these tools will work if used. We shall now explore just what tools they are referring to. Professor Semmler, welcome to Smart Talk.
Thank you very much for inviting me and for organizing this talk, and it's a pleasure to have this discussion.
Great. Well, before we get into the subject of your book, I'm sure that our Smart Talk audience would share my curiosity regarding your personal path that brought you from Europe to join the faculty of the New School in New York City and your chosen area of research, teaching, and writing.
Well, it was almost accidental that I ended up here. I had two offers, one from when I had finished my PhD, one University of Dar es Salaam in Tanzania, and the other one I was waiting for a postdoc position at the US, at Columbia University there and in New York. And that depended a little bit what letter came first. And actually, I had the letter from Tanzania already. And then I said, oh, wait a little bit. And then I got the offer here to come with the American Society, American Learned Society. They provided me with a postdoc stipend here at Columbia University, and they choose this path. And then I wrote a book on competition, actually, on the history of competition theories and competition and the market at Columbia University. And then I got an offer from American University of Washington, D.C., went there for a year, and then I came to the New School and got an offer there. And so I came back to New York. And for me, it was moving from New York to Washington is very similar to being in New York. And I work on both sides, basically on the US and on Europe, in terms of comparing the macroeconomies, the labor markets, the inflation rate, the dynamics of the European and the American economy and fiscal and monetary policies and those things. So I work on both sides, on topics of both sides, so to speak, and that's a great fun to also to be here in New York, to be at the forefront, basically, at the American science of and sciences, in particular economic discussions. And so I learned a lot then here from this side.
Let me ask you an interesting question that just occurs to me, and that is, who were your mentors, your intellectual mentors among the leading members of the economics discipline? Who did you look to as people who really inspired you and you felt were their own research and writing was in the right direction?
Well, I actually also had studied before mathematics and philosophy, and I studied with Carl Friedrich von Weizsäcker philosophy, who was mentioned again in the recent movie. he was a physicist who worked with Heisenberg on the development of the nuclear bomb, but he changed to philosophy to warn the society never to use this bomb. And he was very important for the peace movement in Germany. So when I studied in Germany, I had great sympathy for classical political economy, Adam Smith, Marx, Ricardo, John Stuart Mill, and 19th century, and Marshall, and so also Schaffer theory. So there were a number of colleagues that pursued this also along Keynesian theory of macroeconomics. So I was later actually very familiar with the work in macroeconomics of Kindleberger and Minsky, particularly everybody knows the Minsky moment in the financial crisis. And I personally know him also. We had a whole night discussions in the bus that we were driving, and I know him from other talks. So these were my major influences, but mostly also past economists like Keynes or classical economics, or partly also Marxian theory or Schaffer theory, and reinterpreting Ricardo. So these were some important figures.
For those who are interested, are many of your writings available online?
Yes, the older papers probably not, but otherwise they are all indicated in my CV. That's at the New School, and so they can be picked up if anybody wants to have some specifics from my previous writings. I have collected all the papers, also the older ones, and I can send them too.
Okay, that's a great start. Now, let's move on to the subject at hand. I feel safe in saying that almost everyone who will eventually view the recording of our conversation would agree with you that climate change has arrived and fossil fuels are driving this change. So let me ask the big question right up front. What are the tools economics offers that can help turn back the clock of climate change?
Yes, that's, I think, an important question. Many original contributions to climate economics were using growth theory and the solo growth theory. For example, Nordhaus is basically a solo version of optimal growth theory, where he introduces damage to the economy coming from CO2 emission, and then has to be repaired through some abatement. So these are tools that are coming from growth theory, but growth theory doesn't have much of tools actually available. Most of the theories in growth theory also say, well, the policies are pretty neutral in the long run. You see, they are determined by some trend or total factor productivity, and so this was not a good starting point to develop some tools of macroeconomic tools of mitigation policy or adaptation policy in climate change. So I worked a lot with tools that are coming from macroeconomics, so more from the view of the economy on the short and medium run. So there were a lot of tools already developed in earlier times by macroeconomists that could be used for climate issues and climate mitigation or adaptation. So the standard tools that are coming up there, of course, are carbon pricing, so carbon tax or carbon cap and trade policies. The other standard tools that are particularly used in Europe are the regulation and setting standards, because people are saying, well, the market-oriented part of the profession say, we always have to work with market incentives. Well, but certain things can also be and should be regulated and observed, and also you should set standards for emission, for example, for cars. And so this is a second important tool that the Europeans and the EU Commission uses a lot. Then the third tool is probably the development of new technology, because decarbonization of the economy is not alone reached by some conservation of energy, but you have to produce energy in a new way. And so with energy we produce with solar, with wind, with hydro, water power, with hydrogen, with geothermal power. So there are great new inventions necessary, and phasing in of this new technology into the energy sectors. And this is an important issue, also the new technology. Another important issue in macroeconomics is, of course, the macroeconomic policy tools, what I mentioned, for example, tax and subsidies. So tax subsidies are given to big oil companies, so why not giving subsidies also to renewable energy and taxing energy-intensive sectors. So these are the tax and expenditure and tools of fiscal policy, but there's also tools in macroeconomics for monetary policy. Monetary policy is steering financial flows in certain directions, and why should it be always well, people say market conform or market oriented flows of financial flows? Can be also financial flows to renewable energy sector, for example, credit flows and liquidity and so on. So these are the important, I think, new tools then that come from macroeconomics more than from growth theory. And so we thought, well, we start basically there now and say, well, we have a lot of experience with these macro tools and that we can use now.
You mentioned, and I think there's a good deal of discussion about the efficacy of cap and trade versus a direct carbon tax.
Yes.
From the standpoint of economic efficiency, which do you think is the most appropriate public policy to support?
Well, they are both the method of carbon pricing, so increase the price of your carbon-intensive activity. The one is through trading system, the other one to the tax, to a carbon tax. That has partly institutional reasons why one or the others are used. For example, in Europe, the EU Commission, the EU as a unit to make policy cannot use taxation policy and subsidies. This is the sovereign right of the states. So they can only use cap and trade. That's why it was introduced originally. One shouldn't forget it. It doesn't mean that that's the best method. It has some institutional reasons there. And then the cap and trade is very, very volatile. The prices for cap and trade, very volatile. So they go up and down a lot with business cycles and with the endowment set out for the firms. So, and this is also somewhat a little bit a backward arrangement. So first, I encourage you to do some sins, and then you can later buy yourself out of it. So I think it's somewhat, at least it's not so much the tradition of great European macroeconomists. They were thinking that the public has to take a more important action through a tax, for example, Bigu tax. Yeah, and that is more. Among academics, this is mostly the most popular version there in Europe. Though both have their limitations. we did a lot of study on the effect of carbon tax for European countries, for example, with some macroeconomic models where you have a regime with no carbon tax, you have a regime with carbon taxes, then you want to look at what's the effect on CO2 emission, on employment and output, and so as the results are very, very little. But you cannot raise the carbon tax to a level which is effective so for steering the decarbonization of the economy, because there's so much side effects, the carbon tax, like has effect on income distribution, and certain households will be strongly affected by that. Also, that assumes some a substitution effect, that you, with a high price of one good, you substitute into another good. Well, but that requires that the other good exists. You see, and the renewable energy has to be promoted first to exist. There, and then the substitution effect, usually I taught in earlier times, industrial organization, are very, very slow. So if you raise the price of one good, you want to have a higher demand for the other good. Substituting over, it's very, very slow in the long run. So that's some limitation. Therefore, the other tools are more should be more used, or also used, I would say. We are arguing you should not drop carbon pricing, but you can't reach what you want with carbon pricing.
Well, you raise the point of institutional constraints in Europe, but I think that certainly applies to the institutional constraints in the international level, of course.
Yeah.
And in your book, you identify two of the most serious environmental challenges we face as, first, the shutting down of the Gulf Stream, and also the collapse of the Antarctic ice sheet.
Yes.
And it seems to me logical that addressing either or both of those challenges will require close collaboration by all of the governments in the global community. So what are the arguments that are being made, and do you see us moving forward internationally to address these challenges by joint action?
Yes. So let me first say you're completely correct with what you call some important tipping points in the development that has been called as tipping points or thresholds, where you reach certain threshold and then you get completely different dynamics. So these are all quite complex systems, so the environmental parts, the eco parts, and the economic, very complex system. And so you may trigger then some other effects. And this is, with the two tipping points you mentioned, they are in fact mostly argued that is the collapse of the Gulf Stream. That's heavily discussed also in our handbook of macroeconomics by some experts. Secondly, the melting of the ice sheets. That is, then there are certain other smaller tipping points that one knows, so I can't go through all of them. But one of the major tipping points that has been discussed by climate economists and climate or scientists is the energy problem of the Earth. So that's the work by Hansen. He's was also at the New School. He gave a talk there. And so he was earlier NASA director, was later fired by Bush because of his view. So he maintained that the energy is so coming in from the sun is reflected back to space, but the share that is reflected back to space is decreasing over time. In other words, we are absorbing more and more energy. And this produces this tipping point of with the energy that we are absorbing here that goes up. That is the basic driver of all the other tipping points. And so That's the main impact. The tipping points are also having a lot of other short and medium run effects. So if the tipping points are reached, the severity and the frequency of the disasters will rise. Now one knows that the frequency is rising anyway. One sees this quite observable, and that there are data on that. But the severity of the disaster is seem to be also rising, and so that is the effect of the tipping points. Then one can lay out what the disaster will be, or coming from the collapse of the Gulf Stream or the ice sheet melting. But there are also some longer run effects that one will have with these passing the tipping points. That, for example, agricultural production has tipping points with a certain degree of temperature. Your seeds still go up, but going over 30, 31 degree, the seeds don't grow anymore. So you have tipping points in agriculture and productivity there. So it has many other long-run effects also on labor productivity and so on. So, but this is a very important point, that we might get close to tipping points that are not reversible.
Yeah, the climate experts seem to be coming to a general agreement on how much time we have, and the necessity to respond very quickly with global collaboration to address these issues.
Yes.
But as I sit here and I look at our own situation in the United States, and just look at our use of fossil fuels, it will take decades, it seems to me, to replace the 300 million plus gasoline powered automobiles on the road, as well as the millions of trucks that carry every sort of good required to feed and clothe and house us. So when we think about transitioning to electric vehicles, although that might be essential, as is the dramatic expansion of our public transit systems that we're not really spending the money on. The infrastructure to replace the automobile, to replace trucks. Where are the economic tools that will get us there to dramatically reduce the consumption of fossil fuels and the amount of time that we have left before we have passed the tipping points that you described?
Yes, that's very much true. I think what you describe with the auto industry is, of course, true for many sectors of the economy. The whole transport sector, that also includes not automobile and buses and trucks, but also ships, airplanes.
Right.
So then it's important the resistance or some holding back some change transition there. It's also in the whole household sector and housing sector with new heating systems and so on. Then that it's important electricity production. So that there's more electricity produced with renewable energy. So then in many areas of manufacturing production, steel production, or also in agriculture. So in other words, on the sectoral level, you have exactly the same problem that you described, that there is some irreversibility, some lock-ins, some difficulties to get out of this, and some also heavy public opinion that isn't going along with your proposal to do the transition and the decarbonization. And Germany experienced that at the moment quite a lot. And also, in the US, it's difficult to introduce some carbon tax. It will not come in the US. This is just no way to go. And so, therefore, you are completely correct. But I think there should be given some, in some sense, Yeah, market incentive on the one side, so to behave in this direction, but on the other side, some public infrastructure that supports this. For example, public charging stations, what the Biden administration is also planning. So there have to be quite a strong also public support of this decarbonization. And you are completely correct. That can take, we are saying it takes many years, the millions of trucks to get them into one with green energy. So, additionally is that in the those sectors, you have usually firms, you have particular electricity production or energy production, very big companies there, very big oligopolies there, and it's not so easy for small-scale firms that innovate there with some renewable energy, new ideas to attain a bigger market share. We have written some papers on this, where how difficult it is to phase in renewable energy and alternatives with small-scale firms there that are operate. And you are completely correct. There are some very difficult policy issues, and probably it takes longer than one think to do. Yes.
Well, it brings up the very important issue of how we're going to pay for this. You reference green finance in your book, and you know, many of us have spent a great deal of time trying to analyze the kinds of reforms that might be necessary in our banking system, in our financial system, whether or not the Federal Reserve in the United States and central banks need to have more or less power and authority.
Yes.
What's your sense of where we are with the financial system, public debt, and how we can pay for the infrastructure needs that we face even right now today? When we find that, particularly in the United States, but other countries as well, those who have the ability to pay and maybe are the beneficiaries of intense subsidies already, have fought against progressive taxation. Is there a solution? And
yes. So, and so there are two financial flows, so to speak. So one that is directed by the private sector, so to the private financial industry, and the other one that is directed maybe for the fiscal policy or to central banks, more through the public. And as to the first one, in principle, I mean, the financing just means through an innovation there in the renewable energy. So in principle, you can have crowd finance, self-finance, a credit from a bank, you can have issuing of bonds, or in a more advanced stage, you will be able to issue equity, and on the level of the big institutional investors. So basically, they have portfolios. You can direct or give incentives for portfolios to move into the right direction. So in principle, there are many tools in the financial sector, but only the financial sector can be seen. We have written a lot of papers there also for World Bank and others. The financial sector can be a roadblock for these financing, or it can be a bridge. So the financial sector is usually very short-sighted. So it works with arbitrage mostly in most sectors of financial markets. And what is the financial sector not quite capturing is that on the real side of the economy, you have positive and negative externalities. It's very well known in economic theory, but it hasn't shown up actually in financial thinking. So for example, that is concerning the question of could it be a bridge to the decarbonization or to transition of the energy sector. The financial assets do not reflect these externalities, positive or negative ones. So you would expect, well, you have some equity flow or credit flow or bank loan flow to certain sectors, and they should basically have a lower return because they produce externalities and they should fix the problem in the future. For the problem in the future should be fixed. So, but the financial sector doesn't care about this, these externalities, about this long-run effects of where they're investing. You see, and they also usually don't care much about the other side when the renewable energy has a positive effect in the long run for decarbonization and for transition of the energy. The financial sector also doesn't care much about this long run positive effect. So I was surprised that finding almost no literature in finance that take care of these two effects. But if you want to use the financial sector properly, you see, for influencing this, they should reflect the bad side of the real activity, the external effect with lower returns, and should give some premium for the higher, more productive investments. And this is the financial sector starts now seeing that, and some people try to to talk to the financial sector and tell them that they have to take this into account. And if there is some advantage of the financial sector if they steer the funds towards the renewable energy, for example, you have much less volatility of the asset prices there. If you in other words, it would be a good to tell the financial sector investors themselves, or you gain from this actually when you do this, right? And so that's maybe helpful. And so you can gain because the volatility is lower in terms of for bonds and for the equity, the volatility is much lower. This is called the Sharpe ratio. If you measure the Sharpe ratio in the financial sector for green or brown assets, they are quite different. And
let's take your analysis a little bit back, and I'd like you to comment on what has been done public policy wise with since the 2008 crash. Most analysts attribute a lot of the damage that was done to the economy as a result of the financial instruments that were introduced in the late 1990s and ended up in the subprime mortgage crisis and in the collapse of the collateralized mortgage obligations and all of the sophisticated debt instruments. Do you think we have sufficiently learned the lesson from that experience and are in a position to manage the kind of debt levels that exist now, which seem to be extraordinarily high in every area of the private economy as well as the public economy, given the public debt of the United States government, the accumulated mortgage debt, both commercial and residential, credit card debt, automobile loan debt.
Yes, you are completely correct on this. There was some lesson in the short term learned through the new financial regulation that occurred in the Congress.
Dodd-Frank you're speaking of.
Yes, Dodd-Frank regulation. But many of those practices are slowly arising again. and were not really monitored or sanctions or observed or so, and they are also put aside under the Trump administration, and slowly we are discovering they're coming up again. So this is one thing that would be, well, this is probably just the direction of very more finance sector as a roadblock actually for financing renewable energy transformation. But on the debt issue, that is true with the low interest rate and the unconventional monetary policy in QE. You had over years and the very low and zero interest rate, you had very high liquidity in the economy with a lot of speculative actions there, like not only hedge funds, but also cryptocurrencies. And you have the recent cases of collapsing, you have some bank collapsing now in California. So this huge blow up of liquidity, and then, of course, the cheap borrowing. You use the liquidity to invest into cryptocurrencies. That doesn't make much sense. So, but this is blowing up this the debt in the private sector, but it's probably not so much in the household sector itself, but it's also in the corporate sector, and there are lots of warnings that the bonds, great share of the share of bonds of that may go insolvent or bankrupt now have incredibly increased. So in the corporate sector, the big explosion was occurring with junk bonds and those things. So to the state, the sovereign, I'm a little bit thinking along the lines of Blanchard. He doesn't think that the US will have, as a state, a sovereign state, a huge debt problem. His main measure is there that the growth rate was always greater than the interest rate payments, and now it's a little bit reversed for the new situation there. But the debt of the US economy has been always still stable, and the US dollar will still be the world leading currency for a while without big damages due to debt. Krugman is having this view, and Blanchard, and I wrote also a paper of this estimating the debt sustainability. But where the sovereign debt becomes important, that's in developing economies and low and middle income countries. There it becomes very important, and because it has been increasing a lot and cannot be used for, or can rarely be used for the transition to a green economy. That's an important area.
Does that mean that the policy of the World Bank and its willingness to extend credit to those countries that are most at risk but don't have the domestic capacity to raise the revenue for the new infrastructure? Does the World Bank have, in your view, an increasing responsibility and obligation, to?
Well, I think the World Bank has basically some kind of investment bank on the side that is guiding the credit flows there and borrowing to some developing economies. I think they're taking pretty good care of this. The World Bank and also the IMF are more on the side now to say we need some debt reform, some debt relief of the important emerging market countries or low and middle income countries. That's their line, and to what extent that will be realized, that's a good question. But I also do some work for the World Bank. I've written papers for them, and it was fiscal policy for transition to a low carbon economy was a paper, and we got into exactly this problem that the sovereign the debt in emerging market countries can hardly be used, or the increase of the debt, for the transition. There need other methods now. There are discussions now in recent world conferences on climate change since Copenhagen, namely to set up funds for low and middle income countries to finance the mitigation, but also adaptation into big disaster recovering or protecting and having early warning systems with respect to the big disasters that are possibly coming there. So this is a fund that partly will be given as loans, but partly also as grants. And Jeffrey Sachs has worked this out, that it should be to a great extent given as grants, and this 100 billion funds. And now, in the meantime, I think it's increased to 130 or 150 billion. It should be given as grants and not as loans. And loans would produce again the problem of the liability then and the rise of debt. So there are other financing mechanisms now thought about by the experts there, and I think the World Bank is pretty much on this side now.
Well, that would require that individual members of the World Bank would have to increase their allocations. So each country would then have to domestically find the revenue to contribute to the World Bank's fund, even to make these grants. So it seems like it's like a catch-22. We're back to the same question domestically. The resistance to raising marginal tax rates in the United States, both on the corporate sector and on individuals, leads us with a growing public debt. Rising interest rates does mean that as each one of the treasuries matures, as each bond matures, it's going to be refunded at a higher rate of interest, which means that the government then has to raise revenue to service that debt. It seems to me to be an overwhelming circle of problems, and
yes.
Perhaps, I don't know if you've thought a lot about
yes, there is
modern monetary theorists, like Stephanie Kelton have put forward on how to deal with this, but
Stephanie was one of our students at the New School. She was also in my classes in earlier times, so I know her pretty well. So I think there are certain situations. Let's say it's called the bad debt equilibrium and a good debt equilibrium. And I think the US is still close to a good debt equilibrium, where so puts it the other way, or bad debt equilibrium is this one where there is high debt, there is a rising risk premium, there are rising yields to be paid. The more that's expected by the investor, but the more the governments take this on, the higher will be the debt. So there's a spiral between debt and risk premium, and this is called a debt equilibrium. And this leads to capital flight and this financial reactions and banking crashes and all those things. So, but US, I don't think has reached this point already. You still have sectors of state expenditure which expend more than the growth rate. So you still you have a high interest rate, but this feedback effect for rising debt and rising premium to be paid on this, I think this has not occurred. The dollar is still so strong internationally, the leading currency and the world currency. Everybody runs into the dollar if there's some trouble anywhere. So I think this is not point is not reached true for the US, but for a lot of other countries, this point can be reached easily. That's right, and one has to look at it a little bit closer, so to speak. What is the situation there? Can it be recovered through, for example, some financial reform, can be recovered through additional IMF loans, can be recovered with higher growth rates, or so there is, I think, a difference across countries there, what the situation is, and I'm not so leaning towards the view the US has reached already this tipping point to become a bad debt equilibrium now with this feedback effect. That's not reached yet. I think it's a little bit too much panic. The debt is too well, 110, 113% debt to GDP ratio. Japan has 250%, and Italy has 130, and Greece has 180%. So it's not, I think, immediately debt crisis they are visible.
It reminds me of what, Keynes achieved with Bretton Woods, and that was getting, the major economic powers of the world at the time to agree to basically set aside domestic priorities in order to achieve a level of international balance in the financial sector and with, the monetary systems. So, Bretton Woods fell apart, and now countries like China and Russia and the euro attempted to establish its own monetary system with limited successes too, because it didn't extend to the budgetary and tax systems within those sovereign countries. If you were invited to testify before a United Nations committee, all of the essential elements of global cooperation necessary to halt climate change, what would your specific recommendations be based on, the work that you've done, your research?
Yeah, so the reform on the world monetary system and financial system, this is an important discussion, but I'm doing this a little bit in my international finance class, so there is a lot of discussion on this. I can maybe abstain from this discussion a little bit, whether or not the end of the Bretton Woods system has brought some big turbulence with free capital flows and with booms and busts in countries with financial and other booms and busts, and it's less manageable. Though, but that's true. But on the advice of the UN, well, I'm not an international policy maker and policy. It's a difficult task nowadays with all these different blocks, that you have on the globe. It's a different task, but I think there are two things. There is a bad, let's say, the problem of coalition formation, somewhat. The problem of coalition formation is for these big international tasks, among them climate change or reform of the currency system. The coalition formation is very difficult at the moment. And the earlier idea was for Paris and later that one has the big countries and blocks on the board, US, Europe, China, India. Then you will get easily also the small countries on board. They will join. That was the whole theory of a coalition formation. And I think this has fallen apart now. This was a theory of Geoffrey Hill from Columbia University about the coalition formation. Now one should try to do this at the UN level there and for these conferences there. One of the bigger issues is now we experience more and more now the lot of middle, low income countries are somewhat the victim of climate change in terms of, well, they have not caused much of the CO2 emissions in the last 150 years, but they are affected a lot. You just saw the last one in Libya, where you have basically multiple vulnerabilities coming up there. Yeah, so from extreme weather event to a bad infrastructure with dams that do not work, with multiple vulnerabilities that are there. And they ask for a fair transition, a better transfer of funds and help from the advanced countries in terms of finance and technology and trade to help them. And there are big demands in the last conference. There's always these voices of those emerging market countries. Then you have, of course, nowadays, as you see, the oil-rich countries. The oil-rich countries have a different policy there. So for decarbonization, and they try to step in now into the green development with it. And but they have also their own agenda there. And I worked also with a lot of Russians on climate change issues and climate. In the YASA, there are lots of Russian academics, mathematicians, dynamic system theorists, and so they did this as an interesting topic in Russia, but there is no big sentiment for climate change issues in Russia. So there's not much to be gained there. But in China, there is much more now. That's true. But so finding the coalition now to do this is a difficult thing now to do at the UN. But some help of the low-income countries is definitely necessary to have them on board for climate agreements. And probably also, well, China is an important figure there. India nowadays also more and more. So this is one of the problems, the coalition formation there. And if one can improve this, that would be in the UN, that would be a good. I think that but I'm not it's called now research and academic diplomacy, so to speak. It's called in circles now. We have to see which coalition formation can you get there. Yeah. So, but I'm not an expert on this. There are actually very, very good papers on this.
One does not need to have expertise to see that the vast migration of people from places around the globe that are being both dramatically affected by civil unrest, economic hardship, political upheaval, as well as climate change, all coming together at the same time. The Russian government doesn't have to worry because no one is migrating to Russia. They're not, coming out of distressed places and moving to Russia. I suspect that's
at least not true. Now. Before, yes.
Not now. No, maybe if Siberia warms up from climate change, people will move into Siberia. But we're dealing with this massive movement of people. It has political consequences, but it also has enormous consequences on domestic economies and the ability to absorb this population, to assimilate these people. Does macroeconomics have any solutions or policy insights that would ameliorate or mitigate the impact?
Yes, this is, I think, an important further issue of macroeconomics nowadays. And you are completely correct. That is also intention of our book to say, well, if you drive the decarbonization or transition in the energy sector, there are so many worries at the same time for macroeconomists energy independence, inflation rate, unemployment, growth, income distribution, globalization, and value chain problems, and refugee problem. There are so many other worries that you have to think about what's the priority, what is the combination of worries that you think are the most important ones, and then you pursue this. And that can be only done in terms of macroeconomics. It cannot be in long-run growth theory. Long-run growth theory, we are all fine. So you see, that's exactly the motivation of our book. So you put it at the important point. You put an important point up here. Now, I think though the refugee problem, yes, has many causes now. Social upheaval against authoritarian regimes, socioeconomic difference across countries in the job chances or jobs that you can have, climate disasters in certain regions, and heat waves, and droughts and agricultural decline. So you have many reasons there of these refugee streams nowadays. But one of the things is, I think, too, for example, in Europe, it's a little bit the discussion, just controlling the borders there. But these refugees often come with incredible skills already. They are engineers, they are technicians, they have good education, they have university study finished. And so they are screaming in Europe all over the place about scarcity of people for the new job, for a climate change job. And you need in the transformation not only new capital and machine and technology, you need also different human capital in the direction of now decarbonization of the economies or the energy transformation. You need engineers there, you need technicians there, you need, there's a lack of technicians. They can't put in warming, different heating system in households. Not for a year or two, you don't get any professional to do that, because the people are not there. At the same time, there are a huge number of refugees sitting in some camps and are not integrated there in the job markets there. You are completely correct. There is a great potential, I think, for also refugees that can help to, on the human capital side, to produce a better success there. Yes.
Well, it's a very complex issue, and we've only scratched the surface of that particular issue. There's so much more to talk about in terms of how these people can be assimilated. One of the major problems that we have now with people coming into the United States from the southern border, of course, is where to house them.
Yes.
We have a housing shortage in the United States. The National Low-Income Housing Coalition estimates that we have a shortfall of some 7 million affordable housing units in this country now. And with new people coming in from other countries, that problem is only exacerbated.
Yes, you see it also in New York and New Jersey.
Well, we're slowly coming to the end of our time for this episode, but I can't not talk a little bit about economics and the political economy that the Henry George School has taught over the many decades. I mean, I was initially a student of the Henry George School and before I went to graduate school and earned my master's degree. And in recent years, of course, particularly because of the failure of economists to forecast the crisis of 2008, economists and economics has been criticized for failing to explain how the world really works. And those of us who studied the political economy as written by Henry George argue that the reasons the failure to treat nature, that is land as a distinct factor of production with characteristics that are distinct from those of tangible capital, meaning capital goods, and from labor. So I wonder, to what extent this thinking has impacted you in terms of, do you see nature as a distinct factor of production from what in modern economics is normally thought of as simply another form of capital?
Yes, I think, yeah, we have there's also currently a lot of discussions at the Henry George School there, and one of the main points of Henry George was that, well, land is an income from land and rent is basically unearned income.
Yes.
And I think he is completely correct. It is the old theory already of the 19th century. You find similar things in Adam Smith and Ricardo and Marx in the 19th century thinking, because if you have a scarcity there, you just have land there selling was for agglomerate cities or buildings or other things. That is, I think, important, very important point is unearned income. You have not contributed anything with your sitting on this income to the society in some way, or the marginal productivity theory of neoclassical doesn't apply there. You don't contribute anything to when you get some returns. You get a return with contributing nothing, right? So I think if you think about this is a important proposition that Henry George laid out there. It was always the life of thinking. But I think now we have one other component now there. That's the effect that you below the land, you have discovered in the industrialization now important mineral, oil, and very non-renewable energy or whatever. It's on your land. In other words, you have additional, through that discovery, what's below the earth, below the soil, unearned income, also in a lot of countries. You see, and so you should apply this the same way to the resources that are below your earth. You may have seen the film of the James Dean film in Texas, where he goes along very proud on his new property that he has at land, measures this with his feet, and he's not so much proud about the land, but about the discovered oil below the land. So you see, I think that's a dimension that we should think about, that there are all these cheap resources that as a asset of the nature transforms this into income, and this is all unearned income.
Yes.
Yeah, so that's, I think, some kind of extension that we should think. And the second point is, as a piece of land, as a piece of nature, of an asset of nature, it's important that this is conserved for the next generation, because that's limited in size, limited in nature, limited in quality. And this is an asset of nature, and we cannot extract and completely destroy it now. That needs to be some intergenerational view. The next generations need this as well in the ecosystem and so on. So there are many important aspects of this.
It raises the sense of urgency of what your research has focused on. It raises a sense of urgency that our political leaders need to consider and take action before it's too late, before as we pass the tipping points that you've identified in our conversation.
Yes.
I wish that there was some level of public sympathy for Henry George's basic argument to move toward comprehensive tax reform and begin to tax rents at a very, very high level, close to 100% of the potential rental value of whatever the location might be, whether it's urban, rural, resource laden, et cetera. But I don't see that happening anytime soon, certainly not soon enough to deal with the problems that we've been discussing but I have wondered about the potential, at least in the United States, for some sort of reform of our individual income tax and of our business profits tax structure that would capture unearned rents through taxation through progressive income tax rates on income. For example, why should we continue to distinguish gains on the sale of financial instruments from ordinary income? Why not simply bring all income together, exempt some amount that would be equivalent to what perhaps is the median individual income in the country, eliminate all the other exemptions and deductions, and then impose an increasing rate of taxation on higher ranges of income. At the higher levels of income, we're going to capture a lot of unearned incomes and no longer give, the speculation the benefit of subsidy. That seems to me to be the one possible approach to tax reform that has a political constituency.
Yes, I agree with you. There is some other big proposal that's on the table. We have now done, I think it's a Henry George School paper also in the Social Science Research Network. That's a paper on taxing carbon-intensive wealth. That has several advantages. Get another source of taxation to avoid your sovereign debt problem. That is feels, I think, wealth tax is in the air. A lot of people thinking we have gotten such a big inequality in wealth and income distribution. We have to tax that wealth. But there's a third point that the old tax principle since the 19th century was that those people who enjoy more public goods should pay more because they use more of these public goods. We can just reverse this and say those people who produce more public bads, produce more environmental damages, produce more CO2 emission, produce CO2 emission with their wealth, they should pay a higher tax. We just reverse this. The proportionality principle still holds, you see. And we have a paper on this, and we're proposing this new tax on carbon-intensive wealth. So we hope it goes through the public. It was in some law school now discussed about new tax procedures. That could be another way to go the direction of more fair taxation principle than we have now. Yeah. Otherwise, I agree with your suggestion. But this is the one that is still in the air a little bit, but it could be solving three problems at the same time. Yes.
Well, I think all of us who are involved with the Henry George School hope that the book that you have put together will find an audience.
Yes, the book, yes.
Will generate a lot of discussion among policymakers and maybe lead to some wise choices about the future and our direction of macroeconomic policy. So I thank you so much for taking the time out to join me in this conversation for Smart Talk. And perhaps we should think about coming back together for a sort of an update in a next year to see how some of the dynamics that are going on right now in the world, whether they move forward, whether the externalities are positive, or that the negative externalities overwhelm us.
Very good. They're very good idea. And I want to thank you, Ed, for this initiative to organize this session in this streaming. Though it's raises new issues and maybe new policy directions. That's finally the interest of our political economy work, to bring these important issues to the policy work and say, well, here's something new. That's what you have to do. Yeah, thank you very much for organizing this.
We both have to thank Ibrahima and Andrada
Oh, yes, of course. Yes.
Together and giving us an opportunity to have this conversation and to share it with all the people who are eventually going to come and view it.
Okay.
So,
very good. Yes. So thanking the whole Henry George School, and so have a good now. Well, we can meet next year again to see what is realized in what looks dark.
well, excellent. And that's it for this edition of Smart Talk. For more information on this and other episodes, please visit our website, henrygeorgeschool.org. Again, I am Edward Dodson, and thanks for watching Smart Talk.
Thank you.